Hi everyone, this is Matt from howtogardendesign.com. For today's video, I wanted to take you through a podcast, also a YouTube video that I found by some architects called Second Studio by David and Miranda. And I found their discussion really interesting as I was listening to it. So I thought I would do a reaction style video where we sit together, we listen to the podcast or the video in this case, and I pause here and there and add commentary. Somewhat selfishly, I wanted to play it to see whether or not their views on the design process were similar to mine. I guess you can watch and see. But realistically, it's really just me adding some commentary on some of the more conceptual elements of the design process that I think many people aren't really exposed to and don't really have much of an understanding of. Some of it's a bit abstract and interesting, but I try and bring it down to a level where it's somewhat useful, I think, for those of you who are interested in designing your own garden or backyard. Just a couple of points. I apologize. I recorded this yesterday and my microphone is a little softer than theirs. I'm still getting used to my setup. And secondly, there is a little bit of swearing between the two of them on the podcast. So if that's something, just be aware of. It's not a lot, but it's a little. Finally, it's also extremely long. It took me 3.5 hours, so I'm going to split it up into multiple little sections and release those videos individually. So without further ado, enjoy the discussion.
Podcast hosted by two architects, myself, David Lee, and Marina Bordarone. This week it's just the two of us, and we are talking about what?
The design process.
The design process, right? Why are we talking about the design process?
Because you love to talk about it.
Because a few months ago we did a recording on design concepts, developing a concept for a design, and that recording seemed to have struck a chord with a number of listeners. I think perhaps because the idea of a concept is more elusive. So this is a follow-up sort of to that recording, and also we did a presentation to a school on design process ease, which resulted in a lot of what we're going to talk about today. Slightly reformatted, a little bit different. Right?
Sounds like you're just recycling materials here.
Director's cut. The Snyder cut. Okay. So the design process, right. I think this is a good thing to talk about also because it tends to be somewhat mysterious for a lot of designers and non-designers. Right? The question is, like, what is the process you go through? In school, are you taught a certain thing? Is that how do all architects approach designing buildings and open spaces and whatever else the same way? Is there a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that I'm just meant to be going through? Right.
Right.
I mean, do you think there's a 1, 2? I guess we'll find out.
I mean, I think school probably teaches you some like key steps that you should be looking at to develop your design and therefore become somehow your design process. Once you're out of school, there is many different design processes. It really depends on the individual, depends on the project, depends on your experience. So there is not like one universal way that every designer can design something.
I just want to pause it here because it touches a little bit on something that I've kind of leaned towards over a period of time, which is that I think the mark of professionalism is what I call efficiency or economy of movement. And I think I mentioned this in one of the guides or articles that I've written. You can tell most landscape designers who have a lot of experience working in residential areas, they tend to be able to reach decisions very quickly. Now, the process that I generally teach, as we'll see these guys talk about, is a lot about iteration. So the idea that you have to explore a number of different ideas to see what works best in this particular scenario. And I think when it comes to particular professionals who have a lot of experience basically allows you to kind of cut through a lot of the extra stuff that you may not necessarily need. And that's a good and a bad thing sometimes. Sometimes it's a bad thing because it means you don't explore those opportunities, and I think that's what these guys are going to talk about a bit more. Probably the best example I think I can give is if you're a musician. So I, dabble in playing guitar and bass, for example, and I haven't learnt the fundamentals well enough to be able to get to a certain level and be able to do, say, really good bar chords, for example, on a guitar, because I've taught myself. So I'm an amateur, and I haven't learnt the underlying techniques that allow me to up my game to the next level. But that's fine. I don't really need to. I'm an amateur kind of, mucking around and playing. I guess where I'm heading with that is that most musicians, there's an economy of movement in how they play. They don't have all this extra unnecessary motion when they're playing. They're very quickly getting from A to B, and they're doing so through repetition and training. And I think design is a very similar thing, where the more exposure you have to a number of different projects, the quicker you can kind of get to the point that you need to without all this extra stuff. So let's see what they go on with.
Thing, design a building. And in that sense, that's not so much what this recording is about. Like, it's not going to be like step 1, step 2, step 3. Here you go. Now you have a design. Like, it's not so much that. It's more big picture.
Yeah, and I think we'll discuss why the step-by-step approach is not a good one. Okay, so to start...
Just on that, I like teaching beginners and amateurs a step-by-step approach because, in essence, it's like a recipe where you don't want to skip steps that I think are important. One thing I talk about quite a lot is the idea that you may do things that you feel are unnecessary or you're exploring more than you need to. And that's really because it's really easy to fall into something you think works without really testing it properly.
I think we have to have a base understanding of what design is. And this, of course, ties directly back into the concept recording we did, which if you are remotely interested in any of these topics, you should listen to that one paired with this one. So in that recording, we talk about design as being basically problem solving, right? And if we accept that as being the case, then another way to think about design is as a math problem of sorts. I mean, it's different. It's more creative in a certain sense, but it's a math problem. So in a math problem, you have certain givens, the information that's given to you, and then your job is to work with that within that information to figure out a solution, right? And so
I quite like that analogy. I think that works really quite well. The only difference, I guess, is that in the real world, there are unknowns, right? You can't quantify everything. This isn't getting a whole heap of data and throwing it into a system and then you get a result. So I think that's kind of what he's leaning towards. But fundamentally, design is about finding a solution to a problem. Otherwise, you have art, which is pure creativity, and you have engineering, which is very much, a solution to a problem. And I think design lies in the middle, and I've written about that before, something I call I think it's the design spectrum. So you can look that up if you need to on my website, howtogardendesign.com.
Way is also all about understanding the given variables that you have, right? And a project that would include obvious things like the program, the function of the building, let's say the site of the building, the client, that's actually a really big one. And I think that's something that many architects and designers kind of like jump over, right? And in a sense that understanding the client is just as important as understanding the site.
For those of you who are amateur designers or want to design your own backyard, this is in some ways critical, and I think why I like helping people design their own things is because no one understands the client, you, better than you. And to me, that's where they have a massive margin or gain over any other person coming in to design the project for them. People are scared because they don't want to make mistakes. They're not really sure what to do. But if you work through processes, you understand things way better than any other person who's coming in to visit.
Right. So if we value understanding the location of the projects and all those things, then the understanding of the client has to be equally as valued. And we have to spend just as much time thinking about that problem in the design process. But that has more to do with like people skills, which I think we're going to cover in a different recording. So what happens is that when you are gathering this information, right, this information is actually developing for you a kind of rough outline, a murky image of what the solution is going to be, right? It's not clear, obviously, because it's not the final solution yet, very far from that, but it's giving you, again, the field that you're playing within and an understanding of it, right? And that also means that when you come to design something, you're never designing in a void. There's always something to work with, which actually makes, in some ways, the design process easier. It's really difficult to design with no reference to anything on a true.
This is a critical point, and I think a lot of people don't understand this when it comes to designing anything. Constraints, in this case, help you design. You need to be working within, boundaries. If you just have a blank slate, it's almost impossible to design something that will really work. If you've got the perfect site with infinite money, I mean, that's probably a lot of architects or designers' dream, but reality is constraints are what make things interesting. And the constraints for a lot of you amateur designers or, home designers will be things like money, time. If you're doing DIY, it'll be your ability to build. There'll be a lot of these different factors that come into it, and those constraints can also be flexible. But constraints are where things really, come down to it, and where you can get some really interesting approaches to design, because often, he talked about being a math problem, the solution to something generally is a solution to a problem, and the problem often is, a constraint, right? You've got poor lighting, poor drainage, good drainage, limited funds, all these kind of things that put a limit on the universe of possible options. And I guess when I think of design, particularly for garden design, most people tend to, if we have that universe of options, let's say you've got 1 million different options you can choose from, I would always want people to explore 1,000, and most people explore 10, and they go, oh yeah, that looks good, let's roll with that, and they haven't really pushed beyond and explored that. But at the same time, you can't sit there and explore 1 million, because what have we got? 999,999. That doesn't sound right, but anyway, you get what I mean. Most of those just aren't feasible. You're not going to sit there and have all this amazing paving and these swimming pools and things if your budget's $10,000. So a little bit off track, but I like what he's saying in terms of constraints are really what help you design.
True blank page, right? Really difficult to do that, and also not realistic. So by accepting the fact that we have to understand the information that's given to us, that we have to research that information, that can actually get you a long ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
At the same time, this is not to say that the information you are studying is going to directly give you a solution or prescribe a solution. I think in projects that seem like way too practical in a sense, it's because they just took what was given to them and then made a project from it, when they didn't question the information that was given to them. Does that sort of also make sense?
Yeah, or like when a project feels like it's kind of soulless, you know, when it's like, okay, yeah, here is a building, there is doors, there is windows, there is everything I had on my list, but there isn't the it.
And I think this is also...
I really like this point. It, I think, can be hard to kind of describe to people. But I see it quite often. I mean, you look at any of the buildings around you, if there's new apartments and townhouses going up, it's very much tick a box kind of approach. And I think that's what they're talking about here, where there's information that the architects know they need to get. They get the information, and then as long as they hit certain thresholds, which tend to be regulations, certain percentages, building sizes, all those kind of things, codes, once they hit all those, then the project's kind of done. And yes, they market them as, these amazing kind of places where they've really thought about the user, but often they haven't. And that goes to a lot of places. I think in backyards in particular, you've got a lot of landscape designers or just builders, landscapers, who come in and they reproduce the same design over and over again, changing bits and pieces here and there. They're not really using the site to help influence how the design works, which for me is like the core of design, right? That's the essence of it. Sometimes that works, because if you as a client, you want that, you'll pay someone to reproduce that for you, which can work. But I think in general, I wouldn't classify it as design. It lacks soul, which I think is what they're talking about.
Also the difference between the what and the why, which I think we'll get into, but this is like a lot of times when you talk to, when you're given a program or you talk to a client, right, you ask them, okay, what is the problem that we're dealing with? And they don't give you the actual problem, they just give you like the what, which is, so in the case of a school, so what's the problem? Why do you want a new school? Well, we need, 23 classrooms, and we need X amount of playground space and breakout rooms for the faculty and whatever. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of the question, because that's the program. That's like the scope. That's the what stuff. That's not why. That's very different from saying, well, we're making a new school because we feel it's our job to teach, let's say an elementary school, young students about life, and we don't feel like the building is conducive to that. Well, that is much more fundamental and much more interesting. So
This is fascinating because I think they're getting a bit abstract, but to me, having looked a little bit at marketing in particular, there's a common frame or framing in marketing that talks about the idea that features tell and benefits sell. And I think what they're talking about here is features are what they're calling the program, which is what you need to make a space work, right? So from an architect point of view, they're talking about you need those breakout rooms in a school, you need all these other things that kind of allow the school to function, quote unquote. And from a backyard point of view, you could think of very similar things, right? You need certain areas where you have garden beds, you need the irrigation, you need the drainage, you need, if your client wants a lawn, if they want a pool, you need all these kind of things that help bring it together. But they're just features. If you're going through a garden and someone points and says you've got a clothesline there or somewhere you can hang your clothes to dry, there's a vegetable garden where you can grow vegetables, there's a spa or a swimming pool where you can swim in somewhere, like we know this, right? This is stuff that kind of goes without saying. The benefit side of things, or I think the soul that they're getting at, I think where they're moving, is what do you do with that? And this is where marketing, I think, is way ahead of a lot of other disciplines, which is that the benefit is really how you are going to live in that space, right? You're going to be entertaining your family. You're going to be sitting there creating memories for your kids. There's a lot of power behind all that. And so it's, what's the benefit that they want to provide? Here they're talking about the school. And it's not just the school, right? That's kind of mundane, and, you know, you can imagine these Soviet era kind of just schools that are just bland and soulless. If you start with the idea of what the benefit you want to provide, what's the environment you want to provide these kids, you know, what do you want them to feel like when they go into these places? You often can make things a lot more interesting from there. If you start from that position, yes, you'll have to bring in constraints afterwards. You'll have to think about the breakout rooms. You'll have to think about all those other programs that go to it. But if you start from there, you often end up with something that's quite soulless. But if you start from that benefit position, I think it's a lot more powerful. So from a landscaping point of view for your garden, really think about how you want to feel when you go outside. What's the kind of place that you want to look out into? What's the kind of, you know, what's going to draw you outside to enjoy that kind of space? And it can be pretty abstract. You can get your mood boards out. You can go onto Pinterest and you can find all these things and you can develop a feeling of how you want it to be and throw all that together as you go through your design process. And then you turn around and you start introducing constraints and the core elements that will actually help you kind of bring it to the ground.
So the information I was talking about before, the givens and the variables, could be categorized more as like the what factors. It's just the stuff, right?
Right.
Another way to think about it
So
is that
features.
these things are just ingredients, right? They don't actually, like ingredients in a recipe, the ingredients don't tell you what to do or why you should be doing. So it doesn't give you direction at all. It's just in front of you. And it would be a terrible way to, I assume, bake a pie by taking ingredients and then just kind of putting the ingredients on a plate and being like, look, here's the pie.
Well, I mean, I mentioned it before in terms of a recipe, right? So it's useful. I like the idea of all that information, all those programs and all those other bits and pieces, like how things will work as ingredients and just throwing them all together. And I think that's really common in design, as he's kind of getting to.
Right? There's another process that has to happen of manipulating the ingredients and mixing together and understanding what the direction is. Why are you smiling?
And that's said by someone who makes pie very often that knows the process.
Yeah, that's not how I cook. My method is more like
Take out.
buy the pesto pasta and then heat up the pesto pasta. Okay, that's why I'm not a chef.
Okay, but that's like
Yeah.
that's more almost like research in that sense, right? It's like, yeah, it's what are you given? But obviously you don't design that way. Otherwise anyone could design. Anyone that's rational could design, right?
Yes, that's actually a really, really good point.
I know.
That's a really good point, because I think this gets to another question that like clients have, which is they will say, I already know what I want, right? I just need someone to draw it for me.
I know.
Like who posted, Andy Bernheimer, some architect that I follow on Instagram posted like a screenshot of an email from a client who said, you know, dear sir or madam, like dear sir, I need like an architect, whatever. You were recommended, yada yada. Last sentence said, but I already know what I want anyway. Sincerely, etc. And it's like, well, if you already know what you want, then don't bother hiring an architect. Also, that's a terrible way to understand, again, the problem going
Yeah.
back. Like most clients and most people, and even designers, they confuse the what and the why, right? Well, I fulfilled the program, right? The school I gave you 23 classrooms and et cetera, right? And I also made it sustainable, right? But that's not addressing the core problem at hand, the core motivation.
I think the term motivation is a lot better in terms of describing the benefit than problem. I align problems more with an element of features, like it is features. These are things that need to be addressed. Sometimes they're constraints, sometimes, there are other bits and pieces of these problems. Whereas motivation, I think, is that underlying emotion to do things.
The other train of thought, I think, or the debate in design process is when you come to a project, right? So in a way, what I'm saying is that the design comes out of an understanding of the information, right? Now, the other side of this conversation is that, well, as an artist, as a designer, as a human being, with my own backgrounds, I don't come to the project like fully naked, right? There's some kind of inherent interest that I have that I bring to the project. And so it's a question, like, should it be entirely about the project information, or should it be more about myself and my expression, right, and my journey as a designer, or some kind of combination thereof?
I mean, to me, it has to be the second one, right? Like, it's like asking, a really famous musician who has a really unique vocal style and kind of performance aspect to it to come in and perform a song in a completely generic, bland way. Like, you don't do that. I think if you're going to hire designers to come in and do anything, you're hiring them because it's them, in a way. Otherwise, you just get anyone to do it. You go to any university and just get some random person to do it. You can't, we don't live in a vacuum. You can't separate the experiences this designer's had and, what it helps them inform these kind of things. Every site should be unique, and the design is coming in as one of those elements that will be a variable. I think two different designers would design something the same place in a different way.
And the answer is that it's the combination of thereof.
Yeah.
You can't say that you're coming to a project fully naked. It's impossible. You're a human being. You're not a robot. You're not a computer, scripting program. And you also can't come to the project and declare that's all about your hand and your magnificent artistic formal sketches and things like this. When you do that, then you cease to be a good architect. Okay, right?
Well, and that's maybe the difference between, an artist and an architect, right?
Yeah.
You have responsibility toward the client through the project, an artist not so much. And then on the other side of the spectrum, a response that is very impersonal might be more like a corporate aspect.
This is funny because obviously I touched on this earlier, which is the idea of the artist and the engineer. I think I would say more engineer than corporate, as she does. But again, designer sits somewhere in the middle. Maybe one way to think about it is if you are paying someone to design an aeroplane, you kind of want, regardless of who it is, to come up with a similar outcome. They're not going to necessarily put their own stamp on it because the crux of that is highly problem driven, right? You want the plane to be able to stay in the air, so it needs certain schematics and setups and ways that can happen. And it also needs to be lightweight, right? Like obviously it needs to be able to fly. So it needs to hit certain speed and be able to fly in the air. So a lot of engineers could produce something that will make that happen for you. Whereas an artist, I think, as they're pointing out, is almost entirely unique. If you ask an artist to produce a particular piece for you, they hopefully, if you've got two different artists, they'll produce wildly different things because it's their own interpretation of the brief. And design, I think, sits somewhere in the middle, again, where you want the designer to come in and address the brief in their own way, but there's still practical elements that separate it from art, I think. Art is almost standalone and doesn't necessarily have to interact with the world in the same way. There's no function to it, whereas a design has to be able to function. I can design the most amazing toaster that looks incredible and will sit on your kitchen bench and will look unbelievable, but if it doesn't create toast or toast bread or whatever, it's not really a toaster. It doesn't work.
to a design and a design process, right? When something are done and they're kind of like too plain,
Yeah.
and you don't feel like there was someone behind it, someone who designed it or thought about it.
That's a really interesting point, because I think this may differ depending on what you're after as a client. So in some ways, to me, really, really good design is where they've addressed every tiny little problem at every scale. So from the site wide all the way down to the tiny little bits and pieces where you're sitting on a bench and the bench is just the right size to feel comfortable, and it's got the nice armrest and it's got other little bits and pieces that are really well thought out. And in some ways, good design is almost like you don't even have to think about it as the user. You've just gone in and everything works for you. However, I think what she's saying is valid, particularly probably in the architecture sphere, maybe less so in other areas like industrial design. I'd say fashion probably falls into this as well, with you want to feel like there was a person behind it, right? You want to feel like someone put their mark on this place, because that's what you're paying for, I think.
It does feel like a little bit, maybe corporate.
Yeah. So I think also in the concept of recording, we talk about research and thinking about it as a journalist or a detective, as you called it, I believe. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to go over that again here.
Perry Mason mission.
Right. But I think that's the right mindset to have. So I don't want to go on that too much. But it is important to mention that the research part of the design process is in some way a standalone portion. Like you can clearly say I'm doing research as opposed to producing design, and kind of like that's true. Like on paper, that's absolutely true. But internally, I think as a designer, you can't think that way, because if you think that you're doing research now and I'm not designing, and then later on I'm going to design, you're probably bringing the wrong mental approach to the research.
This is a really good point, and it brings me back to when I was doing my Masters of Landscape Architecture. I remember one of our tutors gave a great point, which has stuck with me for a long time, which is that often we try and set up our pins, right, when we're bowling. So you set up all 10 pins in a perfect row. That's all your research, that's all your thoughts, that's all your different explorations. And then you come down and you'll bowl the ball and everything will be knocked over and you'll have this amazing design. That's not how it works. I've used the word iteration before, and that's really what it is. And I think what he's saying here, a good example would be, let's pretend that you're exploring your own backyard design ideas, and somewhere along the way you've seen an amazing image of a backyard pond, and you realize, actually, I think I'd really love to include something like that. It will introduce lots of different animals and plants and bits and pieces, change everything about your design. The pond itself, actually creating it, requires research, particularly if you're planning on building it yourself, or at least having someone come in to help you figure out how the shape and everything work. I'm not talking about a pre-built one. I'm talking about something that you can do yourself. So you might have gone through all this process and all this creative process, and then you turn around and realize that there's more research that's involved to help you place the pond in a good position and actually figure out how to build it properly. So again, it's this helix, right, where you've got design and ideas and you've explored things creatively and you've come to a new feature, I guess, which will have its own benefits, as we talked about before. And that requires research. And now that research will introduce new constraints and new information and other bits and pieces that will impact things around it. And so in placing your pond and figuring out what it needs to work, you realize that, well, you need a pump, you need all sorts of other bits and pieces. So therefore you need a conduit that gets out there. You need to make sure that you've got the right infrastructure to actually help it work. Maybe maintenance-wise, you need to think about that. You probably need to think about safety elements of it as well, depending on how deep it is. There's all sorts of things and constraints that idea will bring in that require more research and will then be fed back into the design more broadly.
Right. Like we have a tendency to think that design is the act of drawing and creating something, right? Which that's part of it. But design is also research. That's fundamental to the process. But it's a mindset thing, right? You can't approach research saying because we also tend to think that the design portion of drawing and creating is the creative portion, the conceptual portion. And we limit those words, creative and conceptual, to that area where we are actually drawing or modeling things. No, that's false. The researching is just as creative and as conceptual if you do it correctly.
Just before she starts talking, I want to add that's the process that I recommend to people. One of the things I don't like doing is being too prescriptive. I want to have a global audience, so I don't want to turn around and tell people what the best plants are, particularly because A, my plant knowledge of different areas is fairly low, but B, there's experts who live nearby who can provide a lot of that information. So I think for a lot of people when it comes to designing their backyards, you need to have what I call a criteria, which is like a clear understanding of what you want a thing to do or how you want it to look. And that's a bit more abstract and meta. And then you can actually approach local experts who'll give you that information, which, as I talked about with the pond, you then feed back into the design again. So hopefully if you've got a set of criteria for how you want a garden bed to kind of look or feel, you go to a local horticulturalist or nursery, they can say, yep, we've got some things that I think tick your boxes, as well as matching, the conditions that you're working within, such as the weather and the climate. But maybe they don't. And then you have to rethink about things, and do you look for something that's a bit more broad, or do you change your design to accommodate what's available to you? So this is all part of that process, I think, where again, it's feeding back into the design process overall.
So you're saying, like, instead of just looking at maybe, I don't know, data of, I don't know, like age population in that neighborhood to develop my project, or like the size of the streets nearby, or like bare data type of research, maybe there is more of a problematization that needs to happen in your head, and you to think like, what data do I want to be looking at? Or maybe a data that you would not have thought about at first because it doesn't seem like it necessarily relates to a physical building, but it might lead your research and your design process down to a very interesting approach.
Yes, absolutely. There's two analogies to this. The first that I thought of is that when it comes to being a good boss or employer or a good teacher, we tend to think that teaching is all about talking, right? Because I'm taking action, right? I think there's an idea of action and inaction that's also very parallel. I'm taking action, I'm talking, I'm teaching. No, that's half of teaching at most. The first half of teaching and the most important half is just listening to what the students have to say. If it's not a lecture-based course, obviously. If it's a studio course. The other analogy is, going back to chefs, right? Like, there are these cooks or chefs, or I don't know, pastry artists, I don't know what you call them, where they go out and forage and they find their own ingredients. Would any of those chefs say that my cooking process is limited to only when I'm in the kitchen assembling stuff? No, their process starts during the foraging phase. It starts during the research of the ingredients, finding the ingredients and understanding what their value is, right?
This is a really interesting and good analogy, and I think it's one that's a little hard for beginner or amateur designers to understand. So I think the way I would describe it to you would be, in some ways, it's when you're looking for ideas. So if you're on Pinterest or YouTube or Instagram or whatever it is where you are, the ideas that you're gravitating towards tell you something, right? We don't think of it this way, but you may be gravitating towards particular styles, garden styles, or maybe it's particular materials or particular looks, whatever it is. Obviously, that in itself is limited by what the algorithm is showing you. So there's that awareness as well. But ignoring that side of things, realistically, you will be drawn towards particular things. In the same way that if we use this chef analogy, they'll be drawn to particular things that they're foraging for. And as they pick these things up, the chef is kind of thinking about how they're going to use those in the end product. And I would encourage you to do the same. So when you find these ideas, I've got somewhere if you sign up, on my website, howtogardendesign.com, I think I have a link somewhere that basically allows you to sign up and get what I call the idea generator little set of PDFs, and basically it's this free thing that you follow through, and it helps you unpack what it is you actually like about a particular idea. Because I think a lot of times people just get the total and they don't look closely at it enough and go, actually no, you know what I really like? I like these this bar element where you've got this kind of repeated motif somewhere, or I like these particular plants, or the appearance of this foliage, or just the overall mass of color, or the material. It could be I like the size of the pavers, or the color, or the shape, or whatever it is. Like, there's things within images that we tend to be attracted to, and in the same way you're foraging for these different ideas that you want to then mix and match and put together into something that is uniquely your own, in the same way a chef would with a recipe. Again, they're all using similar ingredients, but this process of actually foraging, of doing the research, which in our case is more about, finding ideas, that I think has a big impact on the final outcome.
And they're thinking creatively when they're out in the forest in Denmark or whatever the fuck they're doing, right? They're thinking creatively out there about how this has potential to be mixed with other things. What does this mean for the recipe I'm trying to create or for the problem I'm trying to solve? The same exact thing, right? I think that's a good example, actually.
Yeah, no, I
So
think
do
that's
I.
a very good example.
So
The thing, yeah, the process is not just when you think you're working on it.
mhm.
It's also like when you're moving around and like you say, you're thinking about your project, but you are not necessarily at a desk doing diagrams.
I talk about this a lot, where you can, if you're actively doing this, there's like an active and passive component to searching for ideas in particular, particularly if you're on your phone, and most of us are, and we're sitting there browsing Pinterest and things, and you're making these particular boards and all this other stuff to kind of collate ideas. This is this time when your brain is off, you're doing other tasks and you're off thinking about it, and often you can get these little lightning strikes that go, hang on, this particular problem that I'm having with my design, maybe I approach it this way. And so sometimes people have like notepads and things at uni. We were told to keep that, and you just draw down these little ideas as you go about moving throughout the world. Often can help you kind of stumble across solutions to things that you were struggling with.
Things. It's a little more blurry than that.
It's much more blurry, and it starts from the very beginning before you even as soon as you begin the research, as soon as someone tells you what the program is, those wheels are turning.
And sometimes I feel like sometimes the way to start the research is just go about like the known given, the first thing that will come to mind, right? But the other way to maybe undiscover the things that you're truly unconsciously interested by the project or the site is also a way to start the research.
I would think of this point as a hunch. Sometimes you stumble across something early on when you're exploring ideas that just captures your imagination and attention. And it's the kind of thing that you turn around and for whatever reason you've explored all these other ideas and you come back to it all the time. And to me, that's where the artist side of design can come in. So we talked about artists, engineers. Engineers are way down the other spectrum where everything is about efficiency and, a solution to a problem. And art, I think, is the opposite side where it's pure creativity. It's individualism based on what the artist wants and their perspective and interpretation of things. In this case, I think what she's talking about is the idea of a hunch where, again, you found something that just tickles your imagination. You want to explore it a bit more. At least that's the way I kind of interpret it.
Say that again?
Like, let's say, I don't know, you have this building and for some reason there is something in the site and the client that really interests you, but you can't really figure it out. And then you figure out one day that it's because it's surrounded by bakeries. And that's why you're actually truly interested in this project.
Right.
Well, that's also...
Now, I don't know how bakeries would help in terms of developer design necessarily, but I guess that's as good an example as any in terms of something abstract and weird about the site that actually puts it in that location. That means it's not something you can just copy from one place to another.
a way to drive your research, not only by like, I don't know, massing access and light and shadow and stuff like that, but it could also be about the thing that excites you about the project.
Yes.
Because sometimes it is there, it's already present, right? And you just need to kind of uncover it and reveal it.
I think this is leaning probably much more professionally. Someone who's going to do this repeatedly kind of has to look for these little opportunities. If you're just, a home amateur designer, maybe you want to design something for your property, or potentially friends or family as well. Maybe you do it a couple of times. This may be less relevant, but I think where I would encourage anyone is I generally encourage a prescriptive process, at least initially, to get people going to kind of explore their ideas, but never forget hunches. Hunches sometimes lead to the most interesting design concepts. It's like we talked about earlier, right? The soul, the why of something, the motivation. Hell, if you want to put a giant oak tree in the middle of your backyard or whatever, that's going to take 80 years to reach maturity, and you probably won't even live to see it, but maybe descendants will. Do it. Why not? And try and ground all the other features or all the other kind of problems, ideas, whatever constraints around that kind of singular hunch captured idea. I think that's really interesting. There's no reason that you can't have some whimsy in your designs. Not everything has to be about, finding a solution.
And explore it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's this. I think.
Or like you go to the site, you do your research, you take photos, measurements. Like there is something that makes this space magical, and it's not on any map. It's not something the client mentioned. I feel it by being in this particular spot under this tree that this is a magic thing.
Yeah.
Again, this is something that most beginners don't even think about. They don't think about the uniqueness of their backyard, be it a particular time of day or year, season, whatever it is. They don't tend to incorporate these kind of opportunities in their design. And an example I think I've written about and I've spoken about a couple of times here and there is my parents' house. My bedroom, I just had timber Venetian blinds, and in summer, like it is now here in Australia, I would sit there on my bed in the afternoon looking out of these blinds, and only, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 feet away over a timber paling fence was our next door neighbour's house, and they had a huge 2-story brick house. And at particular points in late afternoon, evening, the sun would hit this wall of brick, and it was incredible. I wish I'd taken more photos of it, honestly, because it happens less and less now, and obviously I don't live at home, but it was just this beautiful, warm glow. And I think that's partly the Australian sun and the bricks that we use and all these other kind of really weird, unique elements to it. But just sitting here, getting this reflected warmth coming off this building was really magical, and I really loved it. And if I were to design my parents' backyard, I would try and incorporate elements of brick on the eastern side of their property in some way, because that would then capture that late afternoon sun and give a little hint of what I was experiencing having grown up there and having lived there, right? Something a designer would never be able to experience, because that's just a temporal point in time kind of thing. And that's the opportunity that if you are designing your own backyard, you can look for those. And sometimes it's unconscious. Sometimes it's you're sitting out the back, having a coffee in the morning, and it's just a particular time of day that's just beautiful. And incorporating those elements, this magic, into your design, I think, is something that a designer will never be able to do because they don't live in the space year round.
So it's just to say that there is the data research, and then there is maybe the more sensible research that is also not to forget.
Sensitive,
sensorial, like like human feeling.
I'd call it esoteric, really.
Things that are not necessarily things that are in the books or maps.
Yes. I think that's a good delineation, and I think it's true. I think that people who tend to be too reliant on the data side of things, their designs end up being very dry and inhuman, right? And there's like a lot of distance between the human nature and then the design itself. And then on the other hand, people who lean way too much into their own awarenesses, the project just becomes kind of irrelevant to a lot of the actual factors at play. But so
that's probably a good point too. It's really easy to get lost in your own head and design something that you find incredible, and then you ignore the fact that there's other users of the site, right? There's other people who are going to use it. So I think if you're designing for your own backyard, yes, it's important you design something that's tailored specifically to you, but it's also about, other members of your family or friends. The reason conventional design works so well is because it hits a broad mass of people. Generally, it hits that 95% where you want to have your entertaining area, you probably want to have a vegetable garden, all these other bits and pieces, because they work so well across a broad range. I guess I would always encourage people to try and put their own spin on those little things and really think about whether you want it and how much of it you want. But yes, I can imagine, me personally, I'd love to have just a small backyard that's just a jungle, right? But that's really not useful to anyone else other than me, perhaps. So it's those kind of things, getting out of your own head a little bit and realizing that you're designing for others.
Despite the importance of the information that's separate from you, I think also design is about understanding being aware of your own intuitions and acknowledging I have these intuitions and knowing what they are. It's okay. First, you have to allow yourself to have intuition. Then second, you have to express that in some way. And then third, you have to try and figure out why you feel this way about something. And I know for myself in my own process, that's a lot of it. And and the intuition is we could do a whole conversation about where that.
Again, intuition to me is just a hunch. In some ways, I think they'd be bringing intuition from previous projects and like being informed by that. Like I said to you, for me, a hunch is something that just pops up into your head, like an idea that you then want to explore further. That's definitely the style of design that I kind of followed, particularly throughout uni, where I would have these kind of weird concepts that I tried to push the boundaries on and see how they would go. And that tended to inform a lot of how I would design.
It comes from. But a lot of times, the intuition that I have or other designers have in their own work is for some kind of legitimate reason, right? For a reason, at least. A lot of times it's legitimate. It's because based on past experiences, something in your subconscious is telling you, like, don't go that way, right? And you go down a dark alley. This doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel good. Go this direction instead. And other times there are intuitions that you have which feel valid to you, but you end up recognizing, well, this is just because of my own experiences, which are in direct conflict with what the problem at hand is. So I can't allow that to take over too much or inform too much.
But that's why, like, the whole research portion, has to be done at a desk on a computer with pens and trace and 3D model, physical model, but it also has to be a physical exploration of where is the building going to take place. Like, you gotta physically go and experience and understand and observe and do detective work and, like...
Well, that's yeah.
I mean, technically we could design things remotely, right? We just need to have the data given to us, a couple of photos of, I don't know, a home remodel, right? A wish list from a client, and then like we can come up with ideas. Is it going to be a good idea? Well, it's probably going to work. Is it going to be the best one? No, because you won't be able to experience what the home feels like,
This, again, touches on something that I talk about a lot, which is I think many people settle for good and don't really push beyond that. They come up with a backyard design that meets all their criteria that they've set out. It has that little bit of whimsy. It's tailored exactly to them. But they don't push beyond that. They don't explore something that could be better. Now, generally, you've got time constraints, right? Like, you've got a narrow window within which you want, or when you want to get a design developed. But for a lot of you, you're probably going to be designing stuff over years and years, potentially, particularly if it's your own backyard and it's been sitting there for a while already. Pushing beyond to explore other ideas, I think, is really important.
The client feels like as a person, right?
Yeah, I think that's also interesting because the idea of visiting the site is something that we talk about in the profession a lot. You can gain so much by visiting the site, and I think that's true. I do think, though, that it is a skill set to go to an actual real life physical place and then to absorb that information that's there and be able to decipher it, right? Because a lot of times the actual physical environment, there's a lot of stuff going on.
Well, and it doesn't mean like it's good and that the design necessarily needs to be based on that.
Yes,
right?
correct.
Like, let's say around your lot is just a bunch of very ugly, dilapidated building. Well, that might not really tell you much about what your building needs to be.
That's actually a really good point. The idea that if your surroundings are not a place that you want to kind of draw into your design, then you can kind of lean the other direction. And if you want to create your own little oasis that is completely divorced from your surroundings, that can work as well. Again, you don't need to draw everything in and try and kind of make sure your design sits neatly within your surroundings, particularly if you're in an area that just you have a small backyard. Everything else looks the same. It's just generic suburban or, small kind of spaces. Then I think you got much more license to go around and really try and make something your own and put something really interesting and fascinating in there that really speaks to you and puts your mark on a space. I actually quite like that idea. I think that would work in a lot of cases for a lot of different people.
you got to know that that's the way they are. You can also put something that's completely out of whack and like way out there if that.
That, again, just touching on that point, one thing I forgot to mention was you can't ignore the conditions around your site. So yes, you can put something that doesn't necessarily match anything around you, but you still have to incorporate, particularly with landscape design, you've got to recognize where things are going to grow, weather conditions, climate conditions, all those other little features or, kind of infrastructure and elements of the site that a professional will be able to help you figure out if needed, or perhaps a landscaper, or just your own research and experience as you go through things. You learn about bits and pieces as you go, but you can't create a jungle atmosphere if you're living, in like, I don't know, the northern US, for example. You just don't have the climate for that, right? So you've got to, that's where the constraints of those things come in. Same thing with sun direction. If you want to create this amazing kind of garden that's whimsical and magical, but is on the northern side of your property, in the northern hemisphere at least, that just won't support that. So that's where reality kind of sinks in as well, I think. Yes, you can go off track and make something that doesn't look like anything else, but you have to recognize and design with the conditions that you're working within, because you don't live in a vacuum, hopefully.
Next to it, like.
Yeah. But I think that's also why there's the balancing, in this case, the balance between what you feel at the site versus what more objectively that information means on paper in the context of everything else, all the other information that you've found or has been given to you, right? To kind of like level it, to put on the same plane, to understand like actually the hierarchy between it. I think going to a site can actually be very dangerous for a lot of designers because they don't understand how to, again, absorb and transcribe that information, and it's overwhelming. There's too much being inputted. There's too much being absorbed, right? I mean, there's like the weather, the sky, there's the sun, there's all these factors there. There's the details of whatever debris, there's the material, there's like a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's easier to just, keep your nose on your screen and make up something, right?
It's true.
You have to deal with real shit.
So in the beginning we said that
just to touch on this point again, this is where you, as the owner, if you're designing for your own backyard, you have a really big advantage, because in some ways you've already absorbed a lot of this information. You almost intuitively know where the good parts of your site are, where the bad parts are, what the weather's like, where the wind comes from. You probably haven't really thought about it before. Most people don't, but this is the kind of thing where you can turn around and think about it, and you can do your research looking at your weather patterns. And a great example for me would be, I'm from Melbourne, originally in Australia. I'm not living there at the moment, but I know in summer, it's intuitively, maybe it's just me, but the weather patterns seem to be where we start off at a relatively low temperature, which is like kind of mid to late teens Celsius. And then over the next 7 to 10 days, the weather climbs higher and higher and higher until you get one of those final couple of days that's like in the high 30s, which is 100 or so Fahrenheit, whatever. Then you'll get a massive storm, then it will drop again, and then it will do the same thing again. And so you get these weather patterns. Now, how does that inform my design? Not really sure, but one thing that does tend to happen also is you get these north winds that come through that are very, very strong and very, very hot. The hottest days we get in Melbourne tend to be when this north wind comes. So in terms of how that informs my design, I know that if I want to enjoy certain spaces in summer, which by itself is going to be challenging because of the heat, I probably want to have something on the northern side of that. It doesn't have to be too tall, but it just has to provide some shelter or coverage. Or perhaps I ignore that because frankly I'm going to be inside because I don't want to sit outside when it's 45 degrees or 110 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever. Maybe that's something I can ignore, but I would have this intuitive understanding of the site because I live there and I've experienced all this stuff. I don't need to sit at the site for hours and hours the way someone new would to kind of absorb all this information.